It was a warm summer evening when I set out on a road trip with my friends, determined to explore the highways and byways of the American Southwest. We had planned our journey meticulously, mapping out every stop along the way, but as we made our way down the deserted stretch of Route 66, I felt that something was off. The sun was setting over the desert, casting long shadows across the road, and as we drove, I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept drifting to the stories I had heard about this stretch of highway. They said that late at night, you could see ghostly apparitions wandering along the side of the road, and that if you stopped to help them, you would never be seen again. I didn't believe in ghosts, of course, but as the miles slipped by and the darkness deepened, I felt a creeping sense of dread. My friends were chattering excitedly in the back seat, their voices muffled by the hum of the engine, but I barely understood their words. All I could think about was the stories I'd heard, and the feeling that we were not alone on this lonely stretch of highway. As we drove deeper into the night, the road stretching out before us like a never-ending ribbon, I began to notice strange things. Shadows that seemed to move on their own, strange noises coming from the darkness beyond the headlights. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the road, but my heart was pounding in my chest. And then, just as I was beginning to think that maybe I was imagining things, something stepped out onto the road in front of us. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. My friends were shouting, but I could barely hear them over the pounding of my heart. As I looked up, the figure was gone, vanished into the night. And as we drove on, I felt we were being watched, that something was following us. We drove on into the night, our nerves frayed and our hearts pounding, wondering what horrors lay ahead on this lonely stretch of highway. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, our minds racing with the image of the figure we had just encountered on the road. My friends were too frightened to speak, and I was too shaken to find the words to break the silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rush of the wind as we sped down the empty road. As we rounded a bend, I noticed something strange on the side of the road. It was an old, rusted sign, half buried in the sand. I pulled the car over, my curiosity getting the better of me, and we stepped out into the cool desert air to get a closer look. The sign was weathered and faded, but I could make out the words, "Beware of the night." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the ominous warning. It seemed like a message from another time, a time when people still believed in the supernatural and the unknown. My friends urged me to get back in the car and keep driving, but I could feel that we were being warned of something. I knew that the legends of this stretch of highway were more than just tales told around a campfire. There was something out here, something that had the power to make grown men cower in fear. As we drove on, the road became darker and more foreboding. We passed abandoned gas stations and dilapidated motels, their neon signs flickering in the night. I felt a sense of unease settle over me, like we were driving into a trap. Suddenly, the car began to sputter and cough, the engine faltering. We pulled off to the side of the road, my heart racing as I tried to start the car. But no matter how many times I turned the key, the engine refused to start. We were stranded on the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea how far we were from the nearest town. My friends were panicking, their voices rising in pitch as they realized the gravity of our situation. As we sat there in the dark, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the desert, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as the night wore on, our fear grew stronger, until it felt like it was consuming us whole. We sat on the side of the road, waiting for help that never came. The darkness pressed in on us, and our fear turned to desperation as we realized we might be stranded there all night. Finally, a car approached in the distance, and we breathed a collective sigh of relief. But as it drew nearer, we saw that it was an old beat-up pickup truck, and our hopes sank. The truck slowed to a stop beside us, and a grizzled old man leaned out of the window. "You folks need some help?" he asked, his voice raspy. We explained our situation, and he offered to give us a lift to the nearest town. We piled into the back of the truck, grateful for the lift. But as we drove, I noticed that the old man was watching us with more than just friendly concern. When we arrived in town, the old man dropped us off at a rundown motel, promising to come back for us in the morning. As we stepped into the lobby, I felt strangely. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The man at the front desk was old and haggard, his eyes sunken in and his skin sallow. He gave us a room key without a word and gestured down the hallway. We walked down the dimly lit corridor, our footsteps echoing in the silence. When we entered our room, the smell of rot hit us like a wall. The bed was stained and lumpy, the sheets threadbare and stained. The air was thick with dust, and the windows were covered in grime. As we settled in for the night, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. There was something wrong with this place. Something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. And as we lay in our beds, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a woman's voice, soft and gentle, but filled with a deep sense of sadness. "Help me," the voice whispered. "Please help me." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. My friends were fast asleep, snoring softly. But I knew what I had heard. We had stumbled into something much darker than we had ever imagined. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to calm myself. I knew that something was watching me. Every creak and groan of the old motel made me jump, and I could feel my nerves fraying with each passing moment. As morning broke, we checked out of the motel and waited outside for the old man to come and pick us up. But as the sun rose higher in the sky and the hours ticked by, it became clear that he wasn't coming. We were stranded in this small, forgotten town with no transportation and no idea how we were going to get out, but we had more pressing concerns than our transportation woes. The events of the previous night had left us all shaken, and we knew that we needed to find some answers. We wandered through the town searching for any clues as to what had happened to the old man. But the streets were empty, and the buildings were abandoned. It was as if the town had been forgotten by time. As we walked, we heard a soft crying sound coming from one of the dilapidated buildings. We cautiously approached, and as we peered through the broken window, we saw a ghostly apparition. It was the figure we had seen on the road the night before, a young woman dressed in a flowing white dress. She was crying softly, and as she turned to face us, we saw that her face was twisted with pain and sorrow. We tried to approach her, but as we stepped forward, she disappeared, leaving only a trail of mist in her wake. We were left standing in the empty building, our hearts racing and our minds reeling. What had happened to this young woman? And why was she haunting this forgotten town? We knew that we needed to find out the truth, but as the sun began to set, we realized that we were running out of time. Something was coming, something that we might not be able to escape. As night fell, we found ourselves back at the abandoned motel, seeking refuge from whatever was out there in the darkness. We sat in our room, huddled together, listening to the sound of our own breathing. But as the night wore on, we began to hear something else, a soft whispering sound, like the wind through the trees. We looked out the window. and that's when we saw them. Shadowy figures moving through the darkness outside. They were coming closer, and we knew that we had to act fast. We grabbed our things and made a run for it. But as we burst out of the motel, we saw that the figures had surrounded us. They were everywhere, moving through the darkness like ghosts. We tried to run, but it was no use. They were too fast, too strong. We were trapped, and there was nowhere left to go. As they closed in on us, I could see their faces for the first time. They were twisted with anger and pain, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They were the ghosts of those who had been forgotten, those who had been left behind. And as they descended upon us, I was in terror. This was the end, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. But then, out of nowhere, a bright light appeared. It was blinding, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything. And when my vision returned, the ghosts were gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving us alone and terrified. We stumbled back to the motel, our hearts pounding in our chests. We knew that we had come too close to the edge and that we might not be so lucky next time. But as we collapsed onto our beds, we also knew that we had uncovered something important. Something that could change everything. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the abandoned motel behind. We knew that we couldn't stay in that forgotten town any longer, and that we needed to find a way out. As we walked down the empty streets, we saw a small gas station in the distance. We hurried towards it, hoping to find someone who could help us. The gas station was run by an old man who seemed surprised to see us. We told him our story, and he listened intently, nodding his head as we spoke. When we finished, he looked at us with a serious expression on his face. "You kids need to get out of here," he said. "This town is cursed, and it's not safe for anyone to stay here." He handed us a map and gave us directions to the nearest highway. We thanked him and left, eager to put as much distance between ourselves and that town as possible. We walked for hours, and as the sun began to set, we saw the glimmer of headlights in the distance. We ran towards them, and when we reached the road, we saw that it was a car, just like the one we had been driving before our accident. We approached the car cautiously, and as we got closer, we saw that it was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, and the engine was running. We exchanged nervous glances, and then we heard a voice behind us. "I see you found my car," said a man. We turned around to see an old man standing behind us. He had a kind face and gentle eyes, but there was a sadness about him that was hard to ignore. "I've been waiting for someone to come along," he said. "I need your help." He explained that he had been stranded on the side of the road for days, waiting for someone to stop and help him. He told us that he had been cursed by the ghosts of the forgotten, and that he was doomed to wander the highways for all eternity. We listened to his story, and we knew that we had to help him. We drove him to the nearest town, and as we dropped him off, he thanked us and gave us a small nod of gratitude. As we drove away, we wondered what other secrets and dangers lay waiting for us on the lonely highways of America. With the old man's help, we were able to find our way back to the highway and our car. It was still there, waiting for us, and we were relieved to see that it was in better shape than we had feared. We thanked the old man and offered to give him a ride, but he declined. He told us that he had to continue his journey and that he hoped we would never have to face the same fate that he had. As we drove down the highway, we felt a sense of relief wash over us. We were finally making progress, and we knew that we were getting closer to safety. But then, out of nowhere, we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was dark, and we couldn't see much, but we knew that it was there. We slowed down, unsure of what to do. But as we got closer, something strange happened. The figure seemed to disappear, as if it had never been there at all. We exchanged confused looks, but we knew that we couldn't stop. We had to keep going no matter what. We drove for hours, our eyes fixed on the road ahead, but we never saw anything out of the ordinary again. We made it back to civilization, and we knew that we had survived an experience that we would never forget. As we looked back on our journey, we realized that we had learned something important. We had learned that there are places in this world that are haunted by the ghosts of the forgotten, places where the past and the present collide, and where the living and the dead walk side by side. And as we continued down the highway, we knew that we would never be the same again. We had seen things that few others had, and we had come out on the other side. But we also knew that there was still so much more out there waiting for us to discover. After our harrowing experience on the highway, we knew that we had to find out more about the figures we had seen. We talked to everyone we could, hoping to find an explanation for what we had witnessed. Finally, we met an old woman who claimed to know something about the ghosts of the forgotten. He told us that these spirits were lost souls who had been forgotten by the living. They wandered the highways, searching for someone who could help them move on to the afterlife. The old woman told us that the only way to help these spirits was to remember them, to acknowledge that they had once existed. She said that the reason they appeared to us was because we had been driving through an area that was haunted by the ghosts of the forgotten. We listened intently to her words, and we realized that she was right. We had been driving through an area that had been forgotten by time, a place where the past and the present overlapped. And in that space, the spirits of the forgotten had reached out to us, hoping that we could help them move on. As we drove away, we knew that we had been changed by our experience. We had seen things that we could never forget, and we had learned that the world was a much stranger and more mysterious place than we had ever imagined. But we also knew that we had a responsibility. We had to remember the ghosts of the forgotten, to honor their memory and help them find peace. And so, as we drove down the highway, we made a promise to ourselves to never forget the souls we had encountered. We knew that they would always be with us, and that they would continue to guide us on our journey through life.